Widow with 7 kids in a falling cabin. A silent lumberjack rebuilt it in days. The first thing I noticed was the smoke. Not much of it. A thin gray thread coming out of a chimney that was leaning about 15 degrees off true, rising up over the pines on the east end of Cutler's Creek. I'd been hauling timber on that road for 6 years, and I'd never seen smoke from that cabin. Nobody had, far as I knew. Place had stood empty since the Harmon family packed up and headed back to Missouri after the husband broke his leg and couldn't work the land anymore. That was 3 winters before. The cabin had gone to ruin in the usual way, roof sagging on one corner, porch boards going soft. The whole east wall pulling away from the corner post where the frost heave had worked at the foundation. I didn't stop that first day. I looked at the smoke, I noted the lean of the chimney, and I kept the team moving. It was November, and I had a load of spruce to get to the mill before the road iced over. Whatever was in that cabin was none of my concern. But I thought about it. All that day, and that night when I was eating alone at my table with the wood stove ticking, I thought about a chimney leaning like that, and a fire burning in the firebox below it. A chimney leans because the mortar's gone or the footing's shifted. Either way, a fire hot enough pushes heat into the cracks, and one cold November night the stones start falling inward, and then you've got a fire in the room instead of the flue. I went back the next morning, not to stop, just to look. But I stopped. There were children's boots outside the door. 7 pairs in a row, smallest to largest, set there neat like whoever owned them had some system. The boots were thin, the kind of thin that comes from being worn too long past their usefulness. The soles starting to separate, the leather cracked along the toe box. There was a light dusting of snow on them that nobody had knocked off yet, which meant they'd been out there since before the snow started, which meant the children sleeping inside were barefooted. I stood there on the porch looking at those boots for a while. Then I knocked. The woman who came to the door, she didn't open it wide. She opened it about 6 inches and looked at me through the gap with brown eyes that had the kind of steadiness in them you see in people who have gotten past being afraid because they've already survived the worst thing. She was maybe 32, 33. Dark hair pulled back plain. A dress that had been mended in at least 4 places I could see. She was not small, but she had the look of someone who'd gotten lean from work and short rations rather than from nature. She didn't say anything, she just looked at me. I am not a man who talks a great deal, never have been. I'm big, I've cleared timber since I was 14, and the work makes you big in the shoulders and the forearms, and I know what I look like standing in a doorway in the dark of early morning. So I took a step back off the porch so she could see me clear and said, "Chimney's leaning." She looked at me, then she looked up at the chimney, then she looked back at me. "I know," she said. Her voice was steady as her eyes, flat and matter of fact, like she'd already done the calculation and come out the other side of it. "It'll go," I said. "Maybe not tonight, but it'll go." "I know that too," she said. And she looked at me like she was waiting to hear what I was going to do about that, because she didn't have options and she knew it, and she was past pretending otherwise. I told her my name. Elia's Cord, she told me hers. Margaret Voss. Widow Voss, she said, not the way women say it when they want sympathy, but the way you'd state a fact. I am a widow. That is the fact of what I am. I asked her how many children. 7, she said, and watched my face. I nodded. I'll look at the chimney. She opened the door. Inside was cold. Not as cold as outside, but cold in the way of a space that a small fire is fighting to heat and not winning. There was one room, the main room, and a ladder to a sleeping loft above, and a door off the back that I guessed was a second sleeping space. The fire in the wood stove was built careful, the way people build fires when they don't have a lot of wood and they're trying to make it last. The children, I counted them before I even thought about counting, were arranged around the room in various stages of mourning. 3 of them on a pallet near the stove. One older boy at the table with a book open in front of him. 2 girls doing something with a piece of cloth by the window. And a baby, maybe a year old, sitting up in a crate near the back wall, watching me with the solemn, wide-eyed stare that babies have when they're taking in something new. All of them had their eyes on me. None of them made a sound. They were clean, that was the thing that hit me. The cabin was cold and near broken and sparse as a bone, but those children were clean, their hair combed, the older girl's braid done up neat. She'd done that. She'd made sure of that even with everything else working against her. I didn't say anything about any of it. I went to the hearth, crouched down, looked up the flue. There was blue sky where there shouldn't have been blue sky. The mortar between two courses of stone near the top had failed and the stones had shifted, opening a gap big enough to put my fist through. Below it, the lintel stone was cracked. The whole top section was held up by friction and habit at this point. I stood up. She was standing behind me watching. "You can't fire this," I said. "It's the only heat," she said. "I know, I'll fix it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Why?" And I didn't have a good answer for that except the honest one, so I said, "Because it needs doing. I want to tell you what the town knew about Margaret Voss, because it matters." Her husband, Carl Voss, had come out from Ohio 4 years before with the plan to run cattle on the 40 acres he'd bought along Cutler's Creek. He'd done all right at it, from what I understood, not rich, but working and getting ahead, the way a man can in that country if he's willing to work. Then the summer before the winter I'm telling you about, he caught fever in July. He was dead by August. She had 7 children. She had 40 acres. She had a claim on the land that was solid enough, but the cabin was on the edge of the property and the main structure. The one Carl Voss had planned to finish that fall was half built out in the field. She had no money to complete it and no man to do the work. The town knew all of this. Some of the townspeople had helped at first. Church brought food twice in September. One of the ranchers, a man named Trescott, had sent 2 of his hands to help put up hay before the freeze. But after that, the general feeling seemed to be that she'd get through somehow or she wouldn't, and either way it wasn't their problem. She hadn't been in the valley long enough to have real roots. Carl Voss had kept to himself. And 7 children was a lot of children. People have a way of looking at 7 children and deciding the situation is too big to take on, so they don't take it on. I knew all of this in the approximate way you know things about people you've never spoken to. I hauled timber. I kept to myself. I ate alone, I worked alone. I came home to a house I'd built alone on 30 acres that bordered the national forest to the north. I was 41 years old. I had been married once, briefly, before I came west, a woman in Pennsylvania who decided she couldn't wait for a man who spent 3 months a year in the mountains cutting timber. I didn't blame her. I understood it. But I'd been alone since, which was 12 years. And alone had become the shape of my life so that I didn't much think about it anymore, except sometimes at night when the stove ticked, and the house was so quiet you could hear the pines moving. I hadn't planned on being involved with anyone. I hadn't planned on anything. But here's what I know about chimneys. They don't wait for plans. I started that morning. I climbed up to the roof. The roof was a problem in itself. I'd see to that separately, and I looked at the chimney from the top. 4 courses of stone needed to come down and be relayed. The lintel needed to be replaced. The footing at the base where the frost heave had worked at it needed to be dug out and reset. It was 2, maybe 3 days of work if I didn't have anything else going, and I had timber contracts to honor. I came back down and told her. "I can't pay you," she said. She said it straight, no apology in it. "Didn't ask you to," I said. She looked at me for a long moment and I could see her working through it, the question of what I wanted, what the catch was, because there's always a catch with men who offer things for nothing. I understood that. I let her look. "My boys can carry stones," she finally said, "and bring mortar so you're not doing it alone." "That help," I said. She nodded once. That was the agreement. The oldest boy was named Daniel. He was 11 or nearly. He had the seriousness of a boy who'd been required to be serious too young, and the wiry strength of a boy who'd been doing a man's outside work since September. He carried stone without being asked twice, and he watched how I worked with the kind of focused attention that means a person is trying to learn rather than just looking. The next boy, Thomas, was 9, and he was the one who kept the mortar mixed and brought it up in a bucket on a rope I rigged to the eave. The older girls, Ruth and Clara, kept the younger children fed and out from underfoot and did it without being directed. She'd raised them right. In circumstances that would have made it forgivable to raise them any old way, she'd raised them right. I worked until dark. The chimney was down to the bad courses by noon, cleaned out and ready to rebuild by mid-afternoon. I had the first 2 new courses laid before the light failed. I told Daniel to keep the fire banked low overnight, no high heat, let the mortar cure, and he nodded like a man accepting instruction and went inside. Margaret Voss came out when I was loading my tools into the wagon. "Come in and eat," she said. I started to say I had food at home, which was true, but barely. I was a man who ate simply and without much thought for variety. She said, "Come in and eat," again in the same tone, and something in it stopped the refusal in my throat. It wasn't please. It wasn't an apology for not being able to do more. It was, "This is what I have and you will sit down and take it, because I won't have you go away hungry from work you did for us." I went in. She'd made a stew from what she had: dried beans, some salt pork, root vegetables from a small store in the corner, enough to go around a table with 9 people at it. The children ate quietly and seriously. The baby sat in the crate eating something mashed that the older girl had prepared. She poured me a tin cup of coffee that was weak but hot. We didn't talk much at the table. It wasn't awkward. It was just that was how that table was. People ate. Then the older children cleared, and the smaller ones were put to bed by the 2 girls, and Daniel sat at the table with his book again, and she sat across from me with a cup of her own, and we talked for a while in the quiet. She told me about Carl. Not much, not the grief, not the particulars, but that he'd been a decent man and a hard worker, and she missed him most at night when the decisions had to be made and there was no one to make them with. I listened. I didn't offer reassurances because she wasn't asking for any. I told her I'd be back at first light, and I'd have the chimney done by tomorrow noon and the flashing reset, and then I'd look at the roof. She said, "You don't have to look at the roof." I said, "The roof needs looking at." She said, "I know," and that was the end of it. On the second day, the chimney was finished by mid-morning. I rebuilt the 2 courses, replaced the lintel with a stone I cut from a slab I had in the wagon. I always carry spare stone. You never know, reset the flashing with lead I had in my kit, and packed the joints with fresh mortar and let it set. Then I went up again and looked at the roof. The roof was worse than the chimney. The east corner that was sagging, I'd seen that from outside, was sagging because the corner rafter had partially failed. Not broken clean through, but enough rot had gotten into the bottom third that it had compressed under the snow load, and the whole corner had dropped about 4 inches. Below that, 2 of the sheathing boards had buckled, and there was daylight visible from inside if you knew where to look. The rest of the roof was intact, but the cedar shakes were old and brittle, and about 2 winters away from failing in sections. I came down and told her. "How bad?" she said, not a question, the voice of a person taking an inventory. "Corner rafter needs sistering. I can put a new one alongside the old, which is faster than pulling and replacing. 2 sheathing boards replaced. Shakes on the east slope need to come off and be replaced if you want it to hold another winter." She was quiet. I could see her working through what she had for materials, which was nothing. "I've got cedar rounds in the mill yard," I said. "I can split shakes. I've got 2-inch tongue-end groove in my barn for the sheathing. Corner rafter I'll have to cut fresh." I paused. "I'll need another day after today, maybe 2. She looked at me. "Why are you doing this?" she said again, and this time it wasn't the wariness from the first morning. This time it was just genuinely trying to understand. I thought about it. I'm not a man who gives quick answers to things that matter. "Somebody's got to," I said finally. "Chimney's one thing. Roof failing in January with 7 children under it is another thing. I know how to fix roofs, so." She held my eyes for a moment. Then she said, "All right," in a voice that had something new in it, not gratitude exactly, or not only that. Acceptance, like she'd made a decision about something. I went back up. "I want to tell you about the town, because it is part of this story whether I like it or not." On the second afternoon, a man named Pierce rode up while I was on the roof. Pierce ran a small, spread about 3 miles up the valley. He was the kind of man who always knew what was happening on other people's property, and always had an opinion about it. He sat on his horse and looked up at me, and then looked at the wagon. "Cord," he said, "didn't know you were working out here." "I'm not," I said, meaning it wasn't paid work, meaning it was none of his business. He sat there a minute. He looked at the cabin. I knew he was thinking about the woman inside and the 7 children and what it looked like. A single man spending his days on her roof. "People are going to wonder," he said. He said it almost friendly, like he was doing me a courtesy warning. I drove a nail. "Let them," I said. He sat there a little longer, and then he rode away. That evening, Daniel told me that 2 men from the church had stopped by in the morning while I was cutting rafters from timber I'd dragged out of the tree line, and had offered to take the 3 oldest children off her hands for the winter, house them with church families until spring when she could better manage. She'd told them no thank you. She'd said it politely, but she'd said it clearly. She told me herself later. We were eating, she'd made something with cornmeal and the last of the salt pork, and she said it without drama. They came this morning, offered to take the children. I said I heard. She said I imagine they meant well. Then she looked down at her plate. But they're mine, every one of them. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. She said people think I can't do this. She wasn't asking for contradiction. She was stating a fact. I said I don't think that. She looked up at me. Something in her face shifted just slightly, like a thing clicking into a different position. She nodded once slowly. Then she went back to eating. Third day. I had Daniel and Thomas with me on the roof from early morning. Daniel was steady, had good feet on a roof, and understood angles and load instinctively the way some boys do. I showed him how to check the sheathing for soft spots before you put weight on it, and he did it correctly the first time I watched him. I showed Thomas how to split shakes with the fro. It's simple work, but you have to feel the grain, and some people never get it, and he got it by the third try. The corner rafter was sistered and bolted by noon. The two bad sheathing boards were replaced by mid-afternoon. The east slope was stripped and reshingled. I used cedar I'd split that morning. It was green, but it would last before the light was fully gone. I came down off the roof in the dark, which I've done enough times that it doesn't bother me. Margaret Voss was standing in the yard, not waiting for me specifically, but not waiting either. She had her arms crossed against the cold, and she was looking up at the east slope. It's done, I said. She looked at the roof for a long moment. Then she said, you squared the corner. I'd plumbed the corner post while I was up there. It had been 2 inches out of plumb from the frost heave, and packed the footing and braced it. It hadn't been strictly necessary for the roof repair, but it was necessary for the cabin, so I'd done it. Yes, I said. She didn't say thank you. She said, come in. That night after the children were in bed, all of them, even Daniel, who'd been up since before light and was asleep on his feet by the end of supper, she and I sat by the stove for a while. The fire was drawing clean and true now through the rebuilt chimney, and the cabin was warmer than it had been since I arrived. She had a lantern on the table between us. She said, what do you want, Ilias? It was the first time she'd used my name. I noticed that. I said, nothing. She said, men don't work 3 days for nothing. I said, some do. She looked at me steadily. She had the kind of face that thinks, where you can see that there's thinking happening behind the eyes, serious and straight. She said, I've been trying to figure out what kind of man you are. What have you decided? I said. I haven't, she said. That's why I'm asking. I thought about it for a minute. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind was moving through the pines with that cold sound they make in November, a dry sound, almost like paper. I'm a man who fixes things, I said. That's most of what I know about myself. She held my eyes for a moment. Then she said, that's not nothing. We didn't talk for a while after that. Just sat. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that happens between people who don't feel the need to fill space with noise, and it had been a long time since I'd sat in quiet with another person and not felt the absence of words as a thing that needed correcting. After a while she said, Carl used to fix things. It was the thing he was proudest of, that he could look at something broken and see how to make it right. She said it softly, without looking at me, looking at the stove. I miss that, having someone who sees what needs doing and does it. I didn't say anything. She looked at me then. Thank you, she said. For the chimney and the roof, you didn't have to. No, I said, but I did. She nodded, and then, because she was the kind of woman who says what she means and leaves the rest alone, she said, I think Carl would have liked you. I went home that night in the dark with the cold clear and the stars close, and thought about a woman sitting by a clean fire in a warm cabin with her 7 children sleeping, and I thought, that's enough. That's enough right there. I was wrong that it was enough. I should have known better. When a man does a thing like that, when he steps into a situation like that, not out of strategy, not out of want, but out of simple necessity and the knowledge that he is the one capable of doing it. When a man does that, the situation has a way of revealing that it is larger than he thought. 2 weeks after the roof, I was back. Not for a reason, or not a single reason. There were small things I'd noticed. The porch boards were soft in 2 places, and one of them had given under my foot the last day I'd worked. The door to the back room hung wrong, off plumb, which meant the frame had shifted, probably the same frost heave that had gotten the corner post. The small things that accumulate in a structure that's been neglected, and that left alone become large things. I came with boards and a new set of hinges and spent a morning on the porch and an hour on the door frame, and she didn't ask me why I was back and I didn't explain it. She just made room for the work to happen. The children had started to accept me by then. Daniel in particular, he was always there when I came, watching, carrying things, asking questions in the way of a boy who has figured out that you're not a threat and has moved directly to learning what you know. I answered his questions carefully. He was a smart boy and a careful one, and he was going to be a capable man if someone gave him things worth learning. Thomas was the talker. He had opinions about everything and delivered them continuously while he worked, and after a while I started to find it entertaining rather than taxing. The girls, Ruth and Clara, who were 7 and 8, were shy of me at first and then abruptly not shy at all, which happened one day when I was cutting porch boards and Ruth walked up and asked me without preamble why my hands were so big. And I said because I'd been using them hard since I was 14, and she thought about that and then asked if I could teach her to use a saw. I looked at her mother. Her mother looked at me. I handed Ruth the saw and showed her how to hold it. The smallest children, there were 3 between the baby and Thomas, a tangle of boys and a girl called Annie who was 5. They just accepted me as a feature of the landscape, the way small children accept things, without category or question. The baby's name was Joseph. In December, I came more regularly. There was always something, the fence around the yard that kept the milk cow from wandering, the smoke house that needed new chinking, the outhouse that had listed to one side. And then the wood supply, which was the real problem. She had a cord and a half stacked, which was not going to get 7 children through a mountain winter. I started cutting. I cut on my own land. I had timber rights on my 30 acres that I'd never fully exercised for my own use because I didn't need it, and I hauled it down and split it in the yard. It took 3 days of hard work on the weekends when I wasn't contracted, and one day I lost from a contract because the timber contractor gave me side-eye about my reliability, and I didn't explain myself, just took the pay cut. By the second week of December, she had 4 cords stacked and split, and covered with a canvas against the snow. She came out one afternoon while I was stacking the last of it. She stood and looked at the stack for a long moment. "Elias," she said, "this is too much." "It's what you need," I said. "You can't keep doing this." I stopped stacking and looked at her. "I can do what I decide to do," I said, not with any heat in it, just fact. She looked back at me. She had snowflakes on her hair and she didn't seem to notice. She said, "I don't know how to repay this." I said, "You don't." She said quietly, "That's what worries me." I understood what she meant. A woman in her position, with 7 children and no resources, and a man repeatedly appearing on her property and doing substantial work. There were implications in that, obligations that could be read into it that she hadn't agreed to and hadn't invited. I understood the worry. I said, "I'm not doing this to own anything, Margaret." She looked at me for a long time. The snow was falling steadily, soft and quiet. "I know," she said finally. And she said it like she'd made up her mind about something. "I know that now." She went back inside. I finished stacking the wood. Christmas came, and I had nowhere to be. This had been true of every Christmas since Pennsylvania, since before that even, and I'd made my peace with it. I went to church in the morning, ate alone at noon, spent the afternoon doing small tasks in the workshop. That was my Christmas. It was not a sad thing exactly, because I'd stopped expecting it to be different. She asked me 3 days before. She said it matter-of-factly. She said everything matter-of-factly in the yard one afternoon when I was there checking the cow, who'd been off her feed, and I'd figured out it was a minor hoof issue and was treating it. She said, "We'll have dinner on Christmas. You should come." I said, "You don't have to." "I know I don't," she said. "I'm asking because I want you there." I looked up from the cow's hoof. She was watching me steadily. "All right," I said. She said, "Good." She had a small tree that Daniel and Thomas had cut from the tree line. She had made paper decorations with the children, the kind of decorations that are not beautiful in themselves but become beautiful because of who made them and with what concentration. The table was set for 9. She'd gotten a goose somehow. I found out later she'd traded 2 jars of preserved tomatoes and a quilt she'd made in September to the Trescott Ranch for it. There was bread she'd baked that morning. There were potatoes and preserved greens, and a pie made with dried apples that smelled like the inside of something warm and long ago. The children were in high spirits in the contained way of children who know that noise has to stay within certain limits. Even Joseph, in his crate, seemed to understand that something was different about this day and watched the proceedings with wide, solemn eyes and occasionally made sounds of commentary. I had brought things. I'd thought carefully about what I'm not a man who gives gifts easily. I don't have the talent for knowing what people want. And I'd gone to the dry goods store in town and stood in front of the shelves for a long time feeling useless. What I'd come home with: peppermint sticks for the children, a small quantity, one each. A piece of good wool I'd seen on the shelf that was the color of a winter sky, blue-gray, that I thought she could use for making something. And for Daniel, a folding rule, the kind a carpenter uses, because I'd watched him measure things by eye and by hand, and he needed a proper tool. She received the wool without saying anything for a moment. She looked at it, then at me. "It's the right color," she said quietly. I didn't know what she meant, but she said it like it meant something, so I let it be. Daniel looked at the folding rule for a long moment and then looked at me and said very seriously, "Thank you, Mr. Cord." And then he opened it and measured the length of the table. We ate. We talked more than we usually talked. The children had questions and stories, and she let them tell their stories without rushing, and she told one herself about Christmas when she was a girl in Wisconsin, about a particular winter when the snow came so high they couldn't open the front door and her father climbed out the upstairs window to dig them free. She told it well, with a dry humor I hadn't seen from her before, and her children laughed, and I found I was laughing too, which surprised me. Afterward, the children helped clear, and the little ones went to bed, and Daniel and the older girls sat by the stove with their things. The peppermint sticks carefully rationed, Daniel with his folding rule, and she and I sat at the table with coffee. She said, "My children like you." I said, "They're good children." She said, "Yes." Then, "You're good with them. It's not you don't perform it. You just—" She paused, looking for the word. "You just are it." I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My husband used to say that a man reveals himself by what he does when no one's watching, when there's no advantage in it." She looked at me steadily. "You fix chimneys, you split wood, you show a little girl how to hold a saw." A pause. "No one's watching, Elias. There's no advantage." I said, "I don't need advantage." She said, "I know." And then she said very quietly, "That's who you are, that's the whole of it." We sat in the quiet for a while after that. The stove burning clean and true through the chimney I'd built, the children settling, the snow outside soft and steady. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine, just for a moment. Her hand was small and work-rough and warm, and she left it there for a moment and looked at me, and in her eyes was something plain and clear and serious that I hadn't seen directed at me in a very long time. Then she took her hand back and looked at her coffee. "Thank you for being here," she said, "for all of it." "Thank you for asking me," I said. January was hard. The cold came down out of the mountains and stayed, the kind of cold that makes the pines crack at night and freezes the water in the bucket by morning. I was there more than I wasn't. Not every day I had contracts. I had my own place to keep. But I came when I could and sometimes when I couldn't and made it work anyway. The town had an opinion. It always does. I heard from the contractor I worked with that some of the church people had started talking about it. The widow and the lumberjack, all that time spent. I knew what they were saying. I didn't care what they were saying, but I cared that it might land on her, might make things harder for her in town, where she needed to be able to buy supplies and ask for credit and stand up straight without people reading something into it. I went to see Pierce, not because I liked him, but because he was the kind of man whose opinion spread, and I wanted to lay something down before it became a thing. I found him at his own barn one morning. I said, "I want to be straight with you." He looked at me with the careful look of a man who knows he's about to be told, something he didn't ask for. I said, "What I do at the Voss place is my business. What you say about it is yours. But she's got 7 children and no husband, and she's fighting hard to keep what's hers, and I won't have what I do for her used against her in this town. You understand me?" He held my eyes. I'm a big man, and I've been in the mountains 12 years, and I don't raise my voice because I've never needed to. After a moment he said, "I understand you, Cord." I said, "Good." I walked away. I don't know what he said or didn't say after that. but nobody said anything to me about it again, and from what Daniel told me, he'd heard things at the feed store, the talk had quieted. February, mid-February and the worst of the cold, and I came to find the cow sick in earnest this time. Not a hoof problem, but something respiratory, the kind of thing that takes a cow down fast in cold weather. She'd come for me herself that morning, walked the 2 miles to my place in the early dark before the light was up, knocked on my door. I don't know why exactly that is the thing that lands on me when I tell this, but it is. She walked 2 miles in the dark in February cold and knocked on my door, and when I opened it, she was standing there straight as a post, breath showing in the cold, and she said, "It's the cow." I think she's bad, and that was all she said. No apology for coming, no performance of helplessness, no asking if it was an imposition. Just, "The cow is bad, I know you know what to do." That's who she was. I worked on that cow most of the morning, and it was touch and go for a while, and then it wasn't. And by noon the cow was on her feet, and I was fairly sure she'd come through. Margaret came out every hour to check and to bring me coffee, and she didn't hover and she didn't ask constant questions. She just kept the coffee coming and let me work. At noon she said, "Stay, eat something." I did. The children were home from school. School had been canceled 2 days running because of the cold and the roads, and the house was full and loud and warm in a way that caught me for a moment when I came in from the cold, the way warmth does when you've been outside for hours in February. I stood in the door for a second and just took it in. The noise and the warmth and the children in various states of movement and argument and game, and her at the stove stirring something, and Joseph sitting in his crate watching me with his solemn eyes. She looked up at me from the stove. She said, "Sit down, Elias." I sat down. We ate and the children talked and she talked, and I said less than anyone, but that was as it always was, and no one seemed to mind. After, when the younger children had been settled for their midday rest, and the older ones had drifted to their various occupations, she sat across from me at the table with her coffee, and she said without any preamble, "I need to tell you something." I waited. She said, "I've been thinking about what this is, what we are." She looked at me steadily. "I want to be honest with you." "All right," I said. She said, "When Carl died, I thought that was the end of it, of having someone. I had the children and I had the land, and that was going to be enough. I told myself it was going to be enough." She paused. "Then you showed up about a chimney, and I've been revising that calculation every week since." I held her eyes. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. She said, "I'm not a woman who says things she doesn't mean, so I'm going to say this once and you can do what you like with it." A breath. "I trust you, with the children, with this place, with me." She looked at me level and direct and unafraid. "I don't know what you want, but if you want to be part of this, really part of it, I think I would like that." I sat with that for a moment. I am not quick with words. I never have been. But I know what I mean when I mean it, and I mean it the same way whether I say it plain or say it complicated. I said, "I want to be part of it." She held my eyes. "All right," she said, quiet and certain, "then you are." Spring came late that year. March was still cold, April still had frost. But by the end of April, the ground was thawed, and the cow had recovered fully, and the children were outside again. And Daniel had started helping me on my timber contracts on weekends, learning the work with the same focused intelligence he brought to everything. I finished the cabin, not just the immediate repairs, the whole thing. The half-built main structure out in the field that Carl Voss had planned to complete. I finished it. Not all at once, but through the spring, working weekends and evenings, and some contracted days I traded out by working extra the following week. I had helped Daniel and Thomas, and later one of the Trescott hands who owed me a favor and paid it in labor. And once the church deacon came with 3 men from the congregation, which I think was the church's way of adjusting its prior position without actually saying so. By June it was done. Not grand, not large, but solid, properly framed, properly roofed, a real foundation and not the old frost-heaved one, a kitchen separate from the main room, a proper stair to the sleeping loft instead of the ladder, real beds instead of pallets, a root cellar underneath for the winter stores. The kind of house that could hold a family for 50 years if it was taken care of. The day it was done, I stood in the yard and looked at it, and she came and stood beside me. She didn't say anything for a long time, neither did I. Then she said, "It's a real house." I said, "It's a real house." She looked at it for another minute. The children were inside, already claiming spaces, their voices moving through the rooms. I could hear them through the walls, the sound of 7 children in a house that could finally hold them. Joseph, who was walking now and running sometimes in the reckless way of babies just discovering their legs, came to the door and stood looking at us with his solemn eyes. She reached over and put her hand in mine. Not the brief touch of that Christmas night. She took my hand and held it, fingers through fingers, the way you hold someone's hand when you've decided something. I held hers back. We stood there in the June afternoon looking at the house we'd made sound, and she was beside me and the children were inside it. And I'm a man who fixes things, and I'd fixed this. Fixed it the way you fix something when you intend to live with it. When the work matters because the people it's for matter. When you put yourself into a thing because that thing has become your thing too. That's all I can tell you. That's how it was. We married in September, on the 40 acres that had her name and mine on it by then, under a sky that had turned that particular blue you only get in early fall at elevation. A blue so clean and deep it almost hurts to look at. The deacon from the church married us, the same one who'd come with his men in the spring to help frame the house. I think he felt a pastoral obligation to be involved in what he'd previously declined to be involved in. I didn't hold it against him. Her children stood in a row behind us. Daniel and Thomas and Ruth and Clara and the 3 small ones in their good clothes, and Joseph in the oldest girl's arms looking solemn and philosophical as he always did. She wore a dress the color of a winter sky, blue-gray. She'd made it from the wool I'd brought at Christmas. I didn't know she'd done that. I didn't know until she walked toward me across the yard and I saw the color of it and understood. I stood there and looked at her coming toward me, this woman who had walked 2 miles in the February dark to knock on my door. Who had said, "I trust you, and if you want to be part of this," and meant every syllable of it. Who had raised 7 children clean and straight in a falling-down cabin in the mountains and not once asked the world to forgive her for needing help. Who had looked at me, the first day, through a 6-inch gap in a door, with eyes that had already survived the worst thing, and decided, eventually, carefully in her own time, that she would let me in. She reached me and she looked up at me, and in her eyes was what had been there on Christmas night and every day since, clear and steady and serious and warm. She said, quietly, just for me, "There you are." And I said, "Here I am." That was all. The deacon said his words and the children were mostly well-behaved, and the September sky was that impossible blue and the house stood solid behind us. Chimney straight and true, roof squared at the corners, and I was 41 years old and I had a family and a home and a good woman beside me who had decided I was worth the having. That's what I wanted to tell you. That's the whole of it, plain as I know how to say it. A man who fixes things found a house that needed fixing, and fixed it. And everything else followed from that, which is how the best things go. Quietly, necessarily, one task at a time, until one day you look up and you're in the middle of something that matters, and you understand that this is what all that work was always pointed at. She's beside me now. Has been every winter since. The chimney draws clean, the roof holds. That's enough, that's more than enough.